Well, hi everybody, good morning. I'm going to speak about writing highly reusable React components. I hope to blow your mind today. Oops, sorry. So my name is Javier Velasco. That's my Twitter handle. I work for a company called Audience. Here you can see me with my beautiful dog. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. And I am the author of this library called React Toolbox, which is a library of React components that implements material design, and it uses CSS modules for styling. The library became very popular like 2 years ago or so, and as far as I know, it's been used by people at Netflix, Amazon, and Walmart. But the library actually have some relevant issues from my point of view. Like, for example, I was abusing of rendering based on props collection. That's something that happens to most of us when we start writing React components. We usually pass like a property with a big collection, and then we render the whole thing. That's happening with a couple of components in React Toolbox, and I think it's not like the best way to do rendering. Also, and the most relevant issue, is that it forces you to a not that easy setup with Webpack. I'm gonna tell you why in a moment, but basically we are using CSS modules, so you have to transpile the whole thing using post-CSS to get theming and stuff, and then the JavaScript should be able to require the CSS, and that is a really messy setup for beginners, especially for beginners and people that are not that familiar with Webpack. Also, it's forcing you to a specific setup, so that's like a big caveat, actually. And also, the customization API is based on CSS modules, and that had like a similar problem because with Bootstrap, for example, you have well-known class names, so you can query, write selectors for those class names, and then override the styles. But that's not possible with CSS modules because every class name is hashed, right? So you have to go with a different strategy. And not everybody gets that strategy. So those are like flaws for React Toolbox. What got me thinking, so still these people is using the library. So probably if I fix those problems, probably the library is gonna get like way better than it is. So I thought a lot. I thought a lot about this, and I'm gonna tell you my conclusions on theming and customization first. So first of all, we have to think about what do we understand by theming and customization. It's not that easy as just changing a color. It depends on what you want to get from a component. So until now, I see like three different concepts about the customization. First of all, you got theming. This is a scenario when where you say, I'm gonna change the color scheme, so every component in my library is gonna have a different primary color. Like for example, I'm shipping React Toolbox with in this indigo primary color, and if you want to change that to a green color or whatever, you just change a variable and generate the whole thing, and every component is gonna have the same primary color. What is important about this theming thing is that those values that are gonna be changed in the future are predictable. So you are free to design your API with a bunch of variables that are going to be changed later. So, yeah. Second one is style customization. This is a little bit different. So picture this. You have this card title in material design, but you see that the title is maybe too small, and you don't care about the spec or whatever. You just want the title to be bigger for some reason. Since it's something that not everybody is going to want to change, I didn't identify that as a variable that can be extracted and changed later for the styles. So you can't really predict what's going to change in this scenario, and that's a problem actually, because still you have to give like an API so consumer can apply those changes. And the third one, and this is something that I think nobody is doing, is the rendering customization. So imagine that I give you a very complex component, like a date picker, for example, and the weekdays are rendered with the capital letters, just with that. and for whatever reason you want to change it, and you want to show the full weekdays names, right? But still, you just put DatePicker, and I'm going to render a very complex structure with everything. So how can you change that? You're facing the same problem as we just said, which is I can't identify what do you want to change, because this is just one scenario. Maybe you want to change to render 2 different months, or change the order for some reason, or I don't know, maybe you want to put like a big phrase with the year, or I don't know, whatever. But the thing is that you can't make that a declarative API. You can't provide a declarative way to change all of this stuff, because you can't identify that, right? So you have theming, you have style customization, and rendering customization. And if you are able to get a way to write a component where you can change those 3 things, in my opinion, you have a fully flexible component. You can take customization to the limits. You can change content, you can change style, and you can dim a bunch of components in an UI kit, for example. So to get to know how can you achieve this, let's think for a second on how React faces styling, and basically how React is dealing with styles. And I don't know if any of you are CSS in JS haters, but if there are some of you here, I hope to change your mind after this, because this is the way I see it. I was a hater before. Everybody is a hater of CSS in JS once in a lifetime, I think. So say you have this concept of a React component. You have this function that gets a state, and render a view, right? That's just JavaScript. But when we are writing front-end applications, we deal with HTML, with CSS, and with JavaScript. But we are no longer writing any HTML. JSX is not HTML, right? But we are rendering, we are creating that HTML from our JavaScript. But it's not happening the same with CSS. You still have these CSS files, and you can use like traditionally class names, right? Import your style sheet, just type the class name, and the browser is going to apply the styles. So the link between CSS and JavaScript in this scenario are just the class names, and that's very weak, because if I go and change a class name or change the CSS, the styles are not gonna be there anymore, right? So in this case, if you want to get them in, you need building and setup always, because CSS is out of your component, right? There are no assumptions in there. So you can rely on custom properties and modern browsers and use those custom properties as sort of variables to get them in. But the truth is that you can't assume that those custom properties are going to be there for every browser. So you come up with a setup that allows you to transform the CSS using Sass, less, post-CSS, whatever, to get those variables in your suite, and to change a variable and regenerate the whole UI kit. So that's a problem. But I have to ask, what if we consider the style a function of the state too? And think about it. You have a button, and this button can be pressed. When it's pressed, the style is going to change. And pressed is part of the state of the button, right? So in the same way that the rendering output, the HTML, let's say the HTML, is depending on the state, the style is going to depend on the state too. And a React Components is a function of the state that is not taking CSS. So, yeah. My question for you is, can we handle CSS as React is doing with HTML? And the answer, of course, would be yes. It's CSS in JS, right? Enforcing hate and fatigue. Yeah, since 2015. I'm going to speak about my favorite, which is InstI Components, because of the API. But any other solution is valid too. You have a bunch of CSS in JS libraries. But what I want to to make clear is that the good thing about CSS in JS is that you are generating the CSS and making the whole thing a component. You are not linking with class names or whatever anymore, right? So in the style components, this is the way you declare a button, for example. So you import this styled object and call this a method. That's going to generate a component that renders to one element, to one node, okay? So then you pass the styles just as a string with this weird syntax. This is, for if you don't know about it, this is going to be later transpiled to a function call. So a is just a function, actually. And you're passing the styles that you want to apply to that node. Here we are destroying the concept of a selector and a class name. We changed here the abstraction layer because before we were saying we have CSS and we have this class name that is going to apply this CSS, and then we put the class name. But here we are just saying we are going to render one node, one React element, and this is the style that the element should have, right? It's important to note that change. And which is really cool about this is that you can interpolate there a function that is going to receive the props that are going to be passed to the generated element. So you can use that properties to generate different CSS. So this would be like state. This button component we are generating here is going to receive a primary property. And when that property evaluates to truthy, look at that, we are going to return a piece of CSS, like a representation of CSS that should be interpolated for the styles in that component. So this is the same as if we, inside the component, say, when the state is primary, we are going to add two different class names. But the abstraction layer is different, because we are dealing with properties instead of class names, okay? And that's really cool, because now we have a button component that renders to one element that can be considered as a primitive, okay? So if we render a button, that button component, it would be something like this. On the other hand, so the important things here are that styles are bundled with the component, that you map the state to properties, which feels natural, rather than composing class names. And the theming API is going to be defined by the library that you use to apply those styles. In this case, it would be styled components, right? So it has an API for theming. If you use something else, probably there could be another way to them components, but they are going to look very different, very similar, probably. And also, overriding styles is going to rely in JavaScript and not in selector and priorities and stuff like that. You know that important thing at the end of a CSS statement? Yeah, forget about it because you're not going to see that anymore. On the other hand, imagine that you have a regular button that you want to create like a primitive, a similar primitive, but with traditional CSS and class names and stuff. So it would be something like this. You have a component that gets a primary property, renders to a button, and then you decide whether you're putting the BDN and primary class names or just BDN, depending on the properties, right? So style is not bundled, it's linked using class names. If that style is not present, the button is going to be unstyled. You are mapping a state to a combination of class names instead of properties that are more readable. And there is no built-in strategy to get theming. You have to set up everything, as we said, with post-CSS or whatever you want to use. And overriding styles, and this is really painful, relies on selector priority. If I write up two specific selector inside my library and you want to override it, you probably won't think about how complex is the selector I'm using. You just try to override it and you don't get the styles. And then you open an issue in GitHub and tell me, hey, this is not working, right? But that's normal. So how can we solve theming and style customization with this style component or CSS in JS in general? Well, as I said, theming is really easy because it depends on the solution of CSS in JS that you're going to use to implement your components. In InstI Components, it would be as easy as this. Just getting a dim object from the properties, and you interpolate the value of some bunch of variables that you can define. Right? For example, here, a main color. Then how can you provide those values using the classic now dim provider, the provider pattern? So you just import that dim provider component from InstI Components and inject an object with the colors that you want to use for your dim. And automatically, the button is going to get it by context. So how can you customize style? Style customization, not theming, but customization. You can use the Style Components API, but also you can use a different strategy. For example, one pattern that I like a lot is to interpolate a function at the end of the primitive, where we are interpolating a property that is assumed that is going to be a piece of CSS. Like, for example, here, props.styles. If I pass in styles a bunch of CSS with padding, for example, the previous rule is going to get overridden, but not with priority, but with interpolation. Okay? So if I want to create a custom button, I can declare a variable styles with those attributes. And the cool thing is that you can still interpolate the properties, and this is mind-blowing, right? Because from outside the component, you can generate styles depending on the properties that that component is receiving. And that amount of properties doesn't need to be like already set. You know, you can add new properties and use that additional properties to interpolate different styles. So from a primitive, from a simple primitive, you can add more properties and create something more complex just by adding CSS and interpolating those props. This is really, really powerful stuff. And then you can render them just passing the styles object. But what if my component is not a primitive and I want to override styles for something more complex that has multiple primitives inside the component? You can use actually the same pattern, but just passing objects, defining an API, a contract. In this case, I forget to highlight that, but you have there two primitives like wrapper and count, and both of them are getting styles, which is the override that we just defined. And the styles object that the counter component is getting is assumed to be an object that can have wrapper and count keys. And those keys are the same as the name of the primitive. Okay, so you can state here that a component, a counter component, is composed by two nodes, two primitives, wrapper and count. And if you want to override the styles for those, you can just pass an object with the style that you want to override, right? And then render your component, and this is going to appear with your custom styles. It's actually very easy. How do you solve render customization? And here, I'm going to show you what I call the component injection. That is nothing but dependency injection. Say you have this counter component. We are importing a wrapper and a counter nodes, or primitives, or components that render to whatever, I don't care, from those wrapper and counter files. But if I want to change those two components, I can just extract the components from the counter component and create a factory, that getCounter function. And I'm going to pass the nodes that the counter is supposed to render. Okay? Just dependency injection. But the cool part, the cool thing about this is that if I want to create my own counter, I just call the factory function passing the primitives that should be used to render that component. And the internals of the counter how the handlers are passed down, how the state is internally managed and whatever, it's kept inside of the counter component. But we are extracting everything from the component, everything that has a style, everything that is going to be rendered afterwards. This is a way to reuse any behavior that you want for a very complex component. Of course, this doesn't make any sense for something as simple as a button. But for a complex component like a date picker or a dialog or an overlay or whatever, this makes way more sense, right? And we are still interpolating those prop styles at the end. So the component that you produce is still customizable. But the cool thing is that you don't have to use style components. This is an example with Fela. And it looks almost the same. But instead of using these template strings, we are using objects. And instead of interpolating those overrides, we are spreading the properties that we pass at the end of the object. Okay? And you can use that even for React Native applications. Okay? Like that, with view and text in using style components native API. But let's be evil. What if I want to have a red background for that counter component, but when the count value is higher than 10? I mean, I am not now like, I want to change the style. No, I want to change the style, but with a very specific condition. And I would just want to change the background, the wrapper element, but not the internal element. How can I get that? Okay, like this. It's exactly the same component, but we are injecting now a pass-through function, what I call the pass-through function. And this is going to be a simple function that receives 3 arguments. First, the name of the node where it's going to be called, the props that the component is receiving, and an instance, just in case you want to access the internal, because you want to pass a handler or access the state or something. Okay? And you spread the return value of the pass-through function. And this allows you to customize how the component is internally orchestrated. In this case, for the red background thingy, the pass-through function could look like this. We are switching the node name, and in case it's wrapper, we are going to add a counter property that is part of the counter component properties. Okay? So now you can use that counter property inside of the wrapper element. Yeah? Is that clear? This is really nice pattern. And boom, you got it. Okay? You can change not only but also how the component is rendered, which properties are passed down inside the nodes of that component, and you can get nearly anything you want using a factory. And also, recall that you don't really need to call the whole factory function. You can do like a partial application, you know, applying some default arguments for a whatever factory component, and then you can call that factory just passing the component that you want to override. That allows you to do very powerful stuff, as we are going to see. But first, I said that I was the author of React Toolbox, and I was thinking about how can I get this solved and whatever. But what about React Toolbox? How can this apply to React Toolbox library? Well, this I hope to be the road for the final version. Hopefully. It's like the 3rd rewrite that I don't finish. That's an issue. But what I'm doing is to extract all this complex component logic in a separate package, which is going to be called Reactiveboxscore Core. And the claim for this package is build your custom React UI kit from a reliable set of agnostic components, higher order components, and utilities. Okay? So what's going to be included? For example, an HUC to make navigable components. And I'm going to show you a demo for a second. I published this a couple of days ago, or 3 days ago, I don't know. in Twitter, and it is like, can I zoom this? Yeah. Okay. So, for example, this with navigation, higher order component, is a decorator that you can use to create any list, can be navigable, sorry. I'm importing this with navigation function, and this is component of type, which is just a function that tells you if a child is a specific type of component. So now, I'm creating here just a separator component, just a regular style component, nothing special about it. I'm creating here the list node, which is the primitive that it's going to render the unnumbered list. It has nothing special either. And the list item node, which is again the same, but there is a small contract for this higher order component, which is the selected item, the highlight item, is going to get a highlight property. So what I do here is to interpolate the highlight property to say if the background should be transparent or gray, right? So if you are familiar with Recompose, you are going to understand this. If you are not, don't worry too much about it. All components in React Toolbox Core are going to be stateless. So you have to manage yourself the state. In this case, the hover index, the element that is currently highlighted, should be managed by you. So that's why I am providing a state layer with the hover index and a handler. So when the hover changes, I keep the hover, the next one, okay? And finally, we use this with navigation function. And the only thing that I need to tell to this higher order component is if the component is selectable. Just passing this predicate, I can tell that if the component is a list item, it is going to be highlighted. Otherwise, it's going to be skipped, okay? And that's all. The last thing I need to do is to map the reference, because you know, we need the reference, the order component needs the reference, so the size of the list items and the size of the list itself. But you should use like a different property. Inner ref cannot be used because style component swallows that property and whatever. But just picture that get ref is like the ref property of React elements. And that's all, okay? Then you just create this navigable list by decorating the list node, okay? And the list item node. So there you go, navigable list and this list item. And I can use a separator inside here. And what this component does is to render, right? This is handling the selection using the mouse, and I can use the keyboard. And the cool thing is that this is even managing a scroll for you. So if you go through the elements using the keyboard, the scroll is automatically managed, right? This is an example of a component that is going to be shipped with React Toolbox Core. There is no styles in here, just logic that involves rendering too, right? That's an example. And the example that I like the most is the complex component, like the DatePicker. The strategy that we saw during this talk was applied in this example. What you're seeing in the left side of the screen is a DatePicker that replicates styles from Airbnb's DatePicker. I'm sure everybody used that sometime. And it works very nicely with 2 months rendered, right? You can navigate them, you can select elements or whatever. It's exactly the same DatePicker. And on the right side, what you have is a React native DatePicker that is built using the same logic as the DatePicker that you're seeing in the left side. But since we are detaching ourselves from the rendering layer, we are just telling how those components are orchestrated. what you get is a React Native completely different date picker that works very nicely and renders an infinite list of months and whatever. And it's the same logic. If I discover a bug handling dates or whatever inside the component and I fix it in React Toolbox Core, that's going to be fixed for React Native date pickers and for React Web, whatever implementation date pickers. And another example would be a higher order component to position elements in the screen. And I am using it in React Toolbox right here. This menu, this cascade menu, knows where is available space to open itself, to calculate the opening direction. And this logic is inside React Toolbox Core, right? So you can use that logic too, and just specify some boxes with shadows and stuff, and you get a menu that is nested and automatically opens to whatever you want. Right? So finally, I want to release a third version of React Toolbox, hopefully, which is going to be like a material design distribution of components that are going to consume React Toolbox Core internally. And I'm planning to change all the flaws of design that we saw, like customizing rendering. You can customize rendering by injecting nodes. You can customize styles with the strategy that we saw without worrying about selectors, just passing objects. Of course, the API is going to be powered by style components, and all components are going to be built with style components. So you can use also JS theming, as we saw. And I'm going to use always children, right, to render everything. No more collection props. So that's pretty much all I got. Thank you. Oh, gracias.
Questions?
No questions. Yeah. Andre.
Thank you, Javi. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Looking forward to the rewrite, and probably I could also help jump in and if I find some time. But I have a question.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned that the third version will be using style components as a styling concept.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, what do you think about this interchangeable style format people are talking about right now? Do you think to support it at some time point, or
the current one?
No, the new one that is being discussed. I don't know if you're aware of it. Like where, all this. So instead of using strings in like CSS and GS, we will people gonna shape some. It will look like a little bit of an abstract syntax tree using like some tokens that looks ugly. But it's not supposed to be seen by humans, so it's kind of an optimization thing to ship it to NPM, to put it in NPM and consume. So what do you think of this?
Cool. I'm not aware of that, sorry.
Okay, let's talk about this, because I think this is interesting. Optimization for a library.
Totally, yeah.
And the second question, you mentioned like the core will consist of this predefined logic, like how components should behave. Would be there any way of change that logic as well? So for example, if I don't want this menu to go in that direction, how can I change the implementation detail a little bit? So I want most of it, but
yeah, totally. Yeah, you can. In fact, for example, for the the picker, notice that you have like an infinite list of months, right? But in the original one, I'm defining just a property because it's like the most regular case where you get how many months do you want to render. But in that case, you can't really tell an infinite list. So what you do is to replace the month element, the month primitive, with a component that is rendering this infinite scroll view list, right? And since that's a component, you can do whatever logic you do inside, or you can transform what is going to be passed down to the internal elements of that specific component. And also using that function where you can control what's going to be passed to each one, you can delete properties, you can replace them. You can do pretty much whatever you want. There is something that I didn't tell in the talk, which is actually something very important, which is that the API is not easy. I mean, the date picker has a lot of different nodes, and the communication logic inside is actually not that easy. For example, the day element would get is selected property, is highlighted property, is the current day property, current week, and whatever, right? So discovering those should be done using the documentation, but I managed to write everything in TypeScript. I also considered Flow at some point to give you typings. So when you are actually writing that component primitive, you get insights on the properties that are passed down, to interpolate custom styles. And that's pretty fancy. I like it a lot. Yeah, but you have to use some typing system.
That is really Thank you.
Hi, Avi. I'm curious about this theming. It's supposed to be for, I think, primarily for colors. And is there any approach like, would you recommend, for example, using or defining the media queries or some values in CSS into the theming context?
Yeah, I think it shouldn't be, well, actually, yes. I mean, I plan to define inside the theming variables some breakpoints as part of the theming thing, because at the end those are values that can be interpolated in the generated CSS. So it makes total sense. And by default, I would probably provide those breakpoints that are defined in the material design spec. But if you want to add your custom or if you want to change it or whatever, that makes total sense. So yes, I plan to do it.
Any other questions? Thank you, Javi.
Thank you.
Coffee break. That's it.
Take care. Bien.